Right. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Cooper Knowlton. I'm a partner at Bergstein, Flynn and Knowlton, where I specialize in litigation and work with a lot of small business owners on a variety of matters. We're joined today by Barry Davidoff, who is the principal at Davidoff Financial Consulting. He's a CPA as well, and very knowledgeable about all things related to the PPP. This is actually, I believe, the fourth time that we've had Barry on this year. We had him on right when the PPP was first coming out. We had him on for some updates over the summer. We spoke this past fall about loan forgiveness, and we've been talking for the last couple of weeks about as it's been looking more and more likely like this new stimulus bill was going to pass. We've been talking about having you on again, and we've had to keep kicking the can down the road as Congress can't really seem to get its act together and get this bill across the finish line. And then yesterday we thought that we were there, and then made the plan to do this. And then, of course, last night Trump hopped on Twitter and said that the stimulus checks weren't big enough, and it looks like now there's potentially a few more days before this thing gets across the finish line. But Barry and I spoke this morning and decided that even though the bill is not a law at this point, and there's still some things that may change, the key provisions, at least the key provisions for small business owners and the key provisions of the PPP loan, we're fairly confident that at this point those will remain largely the same. There might be some tweaks around the edges. The amount of money might change slightly, but I think the key provisions have been worked out, and it seems like both parties are in agreement over some of those things, over most of those things. So we're confident that we can speak with a little bit of authority about what small business owners need to be thinking about as it pertains to the PPP. And so yeah, we're gonna jump in. I think before I turn this over to Barry, and before I ask Barry to sort of get into the second round of PPP, I think just important to know that this is a massive piece of legislation. I'm sure you've seen it's like 6,000 pages or something, and it's combined with the omnibus spending bill. So there's all sorts of things in this bill. Nobody, including the members of the House and Senate, have read it. So there's still a lot that's up in the air. There's all sorts of, I'm sure you've all seen in the news, there's all sorts of provisions related to the $600 stimulus check that people are going to be receiving. Whether it's $600 or $2,000, there's stuff about rental assistance in this bill. There's food assistance. There's all sorts of stuff, but we're going to really, in the next 15, 20 minutes, we're going to really hone in on the PPP and small business loans, because that's I think what's of most interest to our clients and people who are hopping on. So Barry, with all of that being said, thanks so much for joining us. And maybe you can start off by just sort of giving us sort of a lay of the land of what this second round of PPP looks like, and who is and who is not likely to be eligible.
First of all, I want to thank Cooper Knowlton for inviting me today, and to our entire audience, happy holidays. And certainly the bill is changing. However, we feel that the PPP section is probably going to remain about 95 to 100% the same. Most of the attention is on 600 versus the 2000. As Cooper was saying, the omnibus bill is incredible. It even includes a section having to do with the succession of the Dalai Lama in Tibet. Basically, that Congress agrees to support any plan that he has for picking his successor. So it's just incredible, and you can just keep
mind-blowing that this is how our country runs.
And you can just keep on going through it for pork barrel. I mean, it's like particular projects and the wording on some of it, and there are bridges having to do with certain spans, and you know that it's a bridge somewhere in Missouri. That's the only one in that qualified. They needed that vote. So it's absolutely incredible. However, PPP generally did work. Is that it did provide a lot of money to people who needed it, to particularly small business owners, to legitimate companies. There's been a lot of attention on fraud. However, the fraud cases are minuscule in comparison to the billions that were lent. I mean, there are some outrageous cases of it. I mean, you can go through it. there were a couple of cases where people just misused funds. People also were claiming thousands of employees or hundreds of employees, and there were none. But generally, it's been pretty good. And the idea originally was that most of the money would be repaid. And now it's going to be that most of the money is not going to be repaid in terms of loan forgiveness. And we'll get into that. But basically, in the second round of PPP, the second round is currently scheduled for about $284 billion of funding. Now, most of that money had already been allocated in PPP 1 spent. So it's not really an expansion of the program, it's more of a reopening on allocation. And that was one of the things that came up in some of the congressional debate last night, that the PPP program is not really an increase in printing money, but rather is money that's already been printed. Okay? So the key thing is with the PPP is that the limitations have been changed slightly. So, for example, if you are a publicly traded company, you no longer qualify for a PPP loan. And that's a major shift because there were some NASDAQ companies that did apply for it. Shake Shack was the most famous, applying for it. And they basically refunded the money because of public outcry. But now if you're publicly traded on any of the exchanges, you no longer qualify. You do have to show that there was a 25% decrease in revenue between a quarter in 20 as opposed to a quarter in 19. And you can pick any quarter. You can even pick like quarters that are not financial quarters. So you can pick May, June, and July, which is not a typical quarter, okay? But you can pick.
Is that true? Would that be true even for a seasonal business? So a business that
seasonal businesses, basically, you would have to compare. So your seasonal business is fall to fall, summer to summer. So like, okay, I dropped between fall and summer, you can't, all right, you won't qualify. But if you show that like the fall period in, let's just say landscaping in 19 was 25% higher than it was in 20, you would qualify. So it has to be comparable monthly. It has to be comparable 3-month periods. They also made clear that it's not going to follow formal financial rules of first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter to take care of seasonality, take care of new businesses, because there's also a lot of new businesses out there that were formed. There were also businesses that didn't show profits in 19 because they may just be starting up, and profits in 20. There was also large, basically cutouts for minority-owned businesses. That's one of the things that they wanted to do, and I think it's a great program. And again, it's probably going to be women and minority-owned businesses, and it's women or minority. Remember that, there's a big distinction. And so what I had advised over like the last couple of years, because there's always government programs for minority or women-owned, is that in husband and wife small businesses, put 51% in the name of the wife. And that way, minority business or woman-owned business, and you can qualify for a lot of government contracts and a lot of government setbacks like this. So it's going to be a big program. The banks are certainly going to be overwhelmed again by the response.
So just to hone in on a couple of things you said there, for the pool of money that is specifically allocated for female-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses, are they required to show the same 25% reduction? So
far they are. However, it's going to be that banks are more likely to lend to them.
Gotcha.
They're trying to increase the number of banks that are willing to lend.
And will this be the same as the last round of the PPP, where you will have to submit paperwork directly to your bank to show and it will be your bank who is doing the vetting to determine whether or not there's a 25% reduction?
Basically, there aren't regulations on that yet, but the idea would be is that you probably would have to show at least a spreadsheet or make a statement. It seems that more or less it might be just a certification on a form saying I have reduction if you're below certain amounts. I mean, SBA has
Having a little bit of trouble, Barry.
large mountain of paper they even have to develop. Any better?
Yeah, I think it's, maybe, I think you're frozen right now. There we go. Now I can see you again.
Okay. All right, good. So what it is that basically
Perfect.
they have a large amount of paper that they have to develop in order to even get all of the forms developed. And the banks were very much overwhelmed last time just by sheer numbers of people applying. And one thing is that if it's not too early to at least start speaking to your banking representative, hey, I understand that a new PPP loan is coming available. I am definitely interested. What can I do to get on the bandwagon early before anything happens? And the community banks, the smaller mid-sized banks, have been a lot better than Bank of America. I don't want to disparage any particular bank, than the giant big 4 or 5 banks in providing PPP loans.
No, that was certainly our experience, and the experience our clients had, which was you're way better off having a relationship with a small bank than a Bank of America, a Citibank. It was more difficult to get through the layers of bureaucracy there. In terms of timeline, is this? Do you think that, obviously, as we mentioned at the top, there's still no actual law at this point. This is all still subject to the president's signature or overriding a veto here. What is the timeline like, though? Do we have a sense of, let's say the bill is passed into law maybe on Christmas, the day after Christmas? Do we expect that it's going to take the bank some time to get everything in place? So we're probably looking at, or do you think people need to be prepared to start applying in early 2021, or is it possible that it could be even sooner?
I would say mid-January at the absolute earliest. Probably end of January is far more likely, because again, it will take a while for SBA even to issue new guidelines on all of this.
Gotcha.
And it will take longer for the banks. And remember, again, the banks did not particularly like the PPP program because they only received up to 5% in fees. On loans of $100,000 was really small and didn't even cover their overhead for it.
Right.
Remember, PPP will either be forgiven or carry an interest rate of 1%. So there's no money. The only money you can make is on the loan origination fees and the volume of loans that were provided.
Right. So that's actually a good segue. Maybe you can also share a little bit about how loan forgiveness in the first round of PPP is impacted by some new provisions in this latest bill.
Okay. So basically, loan forgiveness has changed greatly. And when we were on in November, right around Thanksgiving, we were saying that they had a simplified one-page form for forgiving loans up to $50,000.
Right.
And which is, you're not submitting data. All that you're doing is certifying that the money was used correctly, initialing to it, and then at the bottom there is a notarized section or basically an attestation section that needs to be completed, saying you're doing this under penalty of perjury and under oath. But the other thing that changed is that SBA also, now under the new law, is the only one that is supposed to really audit, review, or look at numbers. All that the bank is supposed to do on forgiveness is look to see were all the boxes checked. Did you certify to everything? Was the form completed correctly? Not looking at like, hey, the money was misspent, therefore we're not forwarding it to SBA. Now everything gets forwarded to SBA. SBA will obviously be overwhelmed and is almost likely to give forgiveness unless there is some sort of review.
These latest changes, they really just affect the reporting requirements, correct? It doesn't actually change anything as it pertains to what is or isn't actually forgivable for the small business. It just makes it significantly easier for me as a small business owner. I just, if my check was less than less than 50, now it's less than $150,000. The forgiveness terms haven't changed in any material way. All that I need to know, though, that I basically am just going to have to certify that, of my $120,000 loan, 100,000 of that is forgivable. And as a result, no one is really going to be looking over my shoulder. I just need to sign the one page form, and that's it, right?
Right. A couple of minor changes in for what's forgiven is that like it's still 60% has to be used for payroll or salary.
Right.
However, now is that if you received an EIDL loan through the normal SBA program, that now also will be forgiven. Before it wasn't forgiven. So that could be up to $10,000, up to $20,000. So now they've also expanded it. If you spent any money on personal protection equipment, that will also be a forgivable expense. There's also basically any cost for damage caused by public disturbance. Basically, if you were in a riot-prone area, that will be forgiven as well. If you're a company that had to modify your structure in any way, so you had a big open layout and you spent $50,000 to now modify it back into small offices, that will be a forgivable amount as well. So that is a change in the program.
Interesting. All right. And then the last thing I kind of want to spend a little bit of time having you chat about, because you are a CPA, is that there are some specific tax provisions that you mentioned when we were chatting earlier in the day that you think people should be aware of as we near the end of the year. Specifically some tax deductions for PPP expenses and just some other provisions that people should have on their radar.
Right. One of the key provisions of the law is that they now have that if you have an expense that was forgiven by PPP, so you basically you spent $50,000 on payroll and that was forgiven, is that is now still a deductible business expense. Where there had been uncertainty before, Treasury had said that if you received matching funds for an expense, it was no longer deductible. That has now been superseded by law. So you can still deduct your entire payroll, your entire cost, anything that was covered by PPP, you can still deduct. That is fundamental. And that really affects a lot of sole proprietorships and doing well, because before, all right, so 40%, so my payroll had been paid for by PPP. Since it's no longer deductible, that means that I now have a profit of the PPP money, and I'm taxed that at about 35 to 40%. So that's no longer the case. It is now a total tax-free transaction. Okay, so that is a fundamental change. A couple of other things, and since we are approaching the end of the calendar year, was that in 2020, there was a specific provision having to do with required minimum distributions from IRAs. Those were allowed not to be taken. And the idea was to keep money in the IRAs as long as possible. And people who are old, let's just say in their 70s and wealthy, really didn't want the money anyway, because it's taxable income. It can remain in the account. We were not seeing any provision on that for 21, but it might be subject to regulation, so it's something to look out for. And then the other thing is that one of the big provisions of CARES was that you could withdraw up to $100,000 from your IRA. It was non-taxable immediately. Do not take withholding on it, and you can pay it back in 3 years. That was extended, so you can now do that in 2021 if you haven't done it in 2020. And that's a good provision, because like I had advised a couple of small business owners that I have to take some money out of their IRAs and just put it in a contingency fund, because if things really went south, that would be a great way of taking tax-free money out.
Gotcha. So it is an important time to chat with your a tax advisor, because there are some new changes that may impact how you approach the last couple weeks of this year.
It's really critical. And again, as I say to everyone, is that this year the stock market really fluctuated.
Mm-hmm.
It really went down and then came really up. It's important for capital gains to balance your portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
If you have any great wins that you took profits on, try to take some losses against it. If you had losses, try to take some gains, because we don't know if you're going to be able to do that again. But balance those capital assets. And that's something that, both by email and by personal calls, most accountants will sort of make those calls mid-December or earlier, because it's really critical.
Barry, last question from me, and then I'll open it up. If anyone has any questions in the chat, feel free to throw them out there. Is there any reason, we discussed this a couple weeks ago and we chatted about the timeline for submitting your loan forgiveness to the bank, and your advice, if I remember correctly, was to wait as long as possible, because things, this is still a space that's changing, and the banks may change the loan forgiveness terms down the road. Do you think at this point, if I'm a small business owner, do you think there is an incentive for me to get my paperwork in as soon as possible? Or do you think I should still, wait a couple more, especially with the new administration coming in and potentially more legislation around this? Is there, obviously it's case by case, but do you think that there is kind of generally potentially an advantage to waiting to submit that paperwork to the bank?
I would say basically is that January would be a good time to submit it if you have a loan below $150,000, taking advantage of that simplified form. It will not get any simpler than that.
Right.
But the thing is that Chase, for example, is not accepting any loan forgiveness applications at this time. Most small banks in the Connecticut area aren't accepting them either. They're all waiting for guidance, and also the new bill does provide for greater immunity for banks for what they're doing in the whole PPP area. It's shifting it more and more to SBA. So the banks are very happy about the new legislation as well.
Gotcha.
So start getting your paperwork together. It is one page. If your bank is willing to accept it, send it in. And that way also you can then have a better chance of getting a second round of PPP. You're not carrying two sets of loans on your books.
That's interesting. So there potentially, if you have a loan and you're thinking about getting the second one, there may be some benefit then to submitting the loan forgiveness, before, maybe even as soon as before the end of the year, so that you're eligible for the second round.
I would say January, just certain, but your balance sheet will look a lot better. I mean, you no longer have that $100,000 loan outstanding. So, and you get another 100,000, your balance sheet looks a lot more credible. And remember, again, you're still using your balance sheet for instantaneous credit from basically suppliers and from others.
Would there be any benefit to paying it off, or submitting it before the end of the year for 2020 tax purposes?
No, because again, is that it's going to be that, like the law does say, is that all of this will be forgiven.
Right.
It is non-taxable and it is a retroactive section.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that's all I have. I don't know if I see any questions. I don't see anything popping up in the chat. So with that said, I think we will put this up on YouTube and on Facebook probably later in the day. Thank you so much to all of you who joined us. Enjoy your holiday. If you have questions, certainly reach out to me and I can connect you with Barry. And we'll also, when we recirculate the link, we will include Barry's contact information. But wishing everyone happy holidays. Thanks for tuning in. Barry, thank you once again for your time. This was very, very, very valuable, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thank you so much, and happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holidays. Take care.